Sorry.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Let's Talk Seahawks, the podcast for fans like you. We have some breaking news today, news that shocked myself, and I'm sure the other guys here I got on my panel. With me, as always, we have Adam Stellman, my co-host over here on Let's Talk Seahawks, and joining us, we have Mitch from all the way over in the UK, one of the hosts of the 12 Talk podcast, joining us to talk about the Seahawks and Pete Carroll parting ways. Adam, let's talk Seahawks.
Yeah, all my thoughts just went right out of my brain. This wasn't a surprise to me, Rob, in the sense that I wasn't shocked. Like, this wasn't like completely unexpected. I didn't think there was a chance in hell of this happening. We talked about this. I considered we talked. I mean, especially when the rumors came up, with Dan Quinn possibly being brought back to the Seahawks organization. This was always a possibility, especially once we knew how this season was going to end, with us missing the playoffs, with us once again being in the bottom of the league defensively, with us once again being in the middle of the league offensively. There wasn't any kind of step forward between last season and this season. And one of the big things that kept being said by everybody that was from the organization that was able to get a mic in front of them was that there needs to be big changes. And we didn't see those changes in season, which only left me to conclude that there will be big changes in the offseason. Yes, I thought it would be more personnel and staff down the line changes, but it didn't shock me to know that Pete Carroll was not going to be the head coach next season. It hurt me. It's still hurting me. I mean, I don't think you could, for those of you that haven't watched the Pete Carroll's farewell press conference that aired today just before we went live. Please go find that on YouTube. It's on the Seahawks channel. Robbie, you can probably send or post a link on our YouTube channel to that video. Incredibly emotional press conference, and I was right there with Pete the whole time. My two takeaways from the press conference are: one, this was not what Pete wanted. And two, that he is going to be as supportive as he can be with the emotional state that he's currently in. He said several times that he wants to be there for John Schneider, who remains as the GM, and to help the next coach in any way he can. But he is certainly hurting. This is not what Pete Carroll wanted to be doing right now, saying farewell to his coaching career here in Seattle.
Mitch?
Yeah, I'm with you guys. I found it a very difficult watch, to be honest, because like you say, it clearly wasn't it wasn't his plan A to be vacating that role. But I don't necessarily think that he will be too unhappy with the way things have worked out, because he gets to still be part of the franchise. I think if he had have stayed on another year or maybe two with the option that he had following that, he would have probably not wanted to go from head coach to nothing or retirement. I think he would have always wanted there to be something in place for him to stay a part of the franchise, to help continuing the culture. So he wouldn't have chosen to vacate that role now, but I think the situation that he's finding himself in a position to stay, like you say, alongside John Schneider, to still have some input, to still be part of the franchise, that's probably what that would have been plan A for him in a couple of years, I think. So we've not fallen into something that's drastically far away from what he'd want. It just wasn't. He still thought that he could do something with this franchise, as a head coach. So I do think, I know we'll probably get onto this later, but I do think that this had as much to do with opportunities that were presenting themselves with coaches that are available, rather than it just being performance related. I feel like there are opportunities, and this hasn't been a great year. We haven't developed. There are options for us if we do this now. I feel like this was an opportunistic moment to make the call. Do you feel like that?
Yeah, and I have a whole list of coaches I threw together kind of as we were waiting to jump on this podcast. I think that definitely may have played a part. I was shocked today. I thought for sure Pete Carroll was going to get one more year. I knew there was a possibility, but you ended technically with a winning season, and the cards just didn't fall right for us to get into the playoffs, but we technically had the same record as people who made it into the playoffs. So I thought that would buy him one more year to sort of sit in these new schemes, to improve the personnel for those schemes and the knowledge base for the different things within it. So I was shocked. It was something that, for me, it really took me aback. I enjoy coaching. I've coached for several years. Pete Carroll is one of those coaches that I look up to. He's somebody that I like his philosophy. I like his build the player up and the player will perform to their peak ability mentality, instead of beating the player into, mold that player into what you want them to be. Now they fit perfectly. His method is build them up and they will play at their very best, which you can then utilize within your scheme. So once again, I was shocked. Really, I was just taken aback by the whole thing. A lot of respect for him. And in fact, I'm going to take what I just said and lead that into a question for you guys. What does Pete Carroll, the head coach, mean to you? But what do you think he also means to the franchise?
Good question.
I mean, for me, Pete Carroll. I mean, again, there was a few years into his coaching. I mean, I can go back to when we first heard Pete Carroll was coming over. Now, I obviously knew who he was. Following college football, I knew Pete Carroll was, the coach that took USC to the championship. Being a Pac-12 fan, I watched USC kick our butts for several years while he was down there. And when I say our butts, I mean the UW or Washington schools or other schools in the Pac-12. It was a very timely hire. It was it was kind of the obvious hire. I didn't think it was going to work out. I mean, when we look at what Pete Carroll's track record had been in the NFL up to that point, before going back to college and making his name in USC, he was just kind of a so-so coach. And I think the biggest thing for me was watching Pete Carroll transform the Seahawks franchise into what it is today, because it all started. This whole era started with him. I mean, Pete Carroll brought in this philosophy, this coaching philosophy, this life philosophy, the always compete philosophy. He brought John Schneider over. He brought in guys like Dan Quinn, and I'm forgetting all the other shaved head, goatee wearing coaches that we had on defense over the years. But Pete Carroll's meant everything. I mean, I've been a Seahawks fan since I can remember. I mean, I went as Matt Hasselbeck for like 3 Halloweens in a row, which is probably not smart because it was already in the genetics that my hair was going to be disappearing on top at some point, and I may have sped that process along by shaving it down. But he brought this franchise, the city. He brought me my first Super Bowl, so far our only Super Bowl championship, and made for the most exciting football I've ever gotten to watch in my life. We were always in it. There was not a season as a Seahawks fan since Pete Carroll got here where you thought we don't have a shot. And that is not something that I was able to say until the Pete Carroll era started. There were times during the John Gruden era John Gruden. Jeez, Adam. Not John Gruden. The pre-John Moore era. That was 1 year, and why am I spacing on the coach before? Thank you, Mike Holmgren. My gosh, this is why I don't do the name stuff. But yeah. I mean, Pete Carroll was everything. I don't know who I know we talked all season about the identity of the Seahawks and who are they, but now we really don't know who the Seahawks are. Pete Carroll was the identity of the Seahawks for the last 14 years. What are they now? That's what I'm left with.
Yeah, I would say some similar things to you actually. Ever since I've been a Seahawks fan, Pete Carroll has been the head coach, and ever since Pete Carroll has been the head coach, the Seahawks have been him. In that time they've been consistently in every game because of that belief, in that competitiveness, and the culture that is currently there now is all brought by Pete. So for me, he is consistency and he is consummate belief. That's what has always been there. Whilst I've been a fan, watching 2-minute drills with the game on the line, the amount of times we saw Russell Wilson do it, and now we're seeing Drew Lock do it, and we see Geno Smith do it. There is ability there in the players to pull those things off. There is coordinators calling those plays, but behind all of that, there is a philosophy from Pete Carroll making teams believe that anything can happen if we play to our potential and listen to the coaches, and he's always unwavering in his belief that there is still something you can get out of a game, and it absolutely 100% translates in what we've seen with the clutch 2-minute drills and stuff. So I don't know how we look after this. I don't know how many of those philosophies carry over, whether the new coach that comes in can add to them, or whether the new head coach will strip some of those things away and impose their own new philosophies. I hope we keep some of that identity, and on the field I hope we still keep some of our run first sort of style, because there is an identity to our play as well as the identity of our mentality to the way we play. So there is a lot of characteristics I hope we can try to retain, but you also can't tell a new head coach how to play, because that's how we've always played. They have to be able to come in and be unrestrained in that way. So
I do want to say, sorry, if you weren't done, Mitch, go ahead.
I'm done.
For those who've watched the podcast over the last several months, we do have another contributor from the 12 Talk podcast who's been on with us several times. That's Josh Edwards. He's kind of dialed in here with his own little thoughts. He wasn't able to join us on the stream today. He's working away from home and so couldn't jump on, but he just wanted to get his kind of thoughts in here to answer Rob's question that was posed, what Pete Carroll's meant to him. So he just said Pete Carroll's a Seahawks legend. He brought a new ethos, coached some great players, and brought us our first Super Bowl. The last few years have been tough, and it's shown that the league maybe has moved on. He bowed out with grace, and it's time for us as a team to push forward. I mean, I think all of us feel that way. Oh, thanks. I didn't realize there was a way to do that, Robbie. I could have just put that up. But look, I think we all agree with Josh's sentiment. I mean, certainly, I don't think anybody. Graceful isn't probably a word that any of us would use to describe Pete Carroll if you watch him coaching on the sidelines. But I agree with what Josh says. I think this was maybe, if you, in retrospect, maybe this was a great time for him to step away. I mean, goes out on a winning season, goes out knowing the culture that he established here, goes out knowing with GM John Schneider still in place that the Seahawks are in good hands moving forward. I think, to your point earlier, Mitch, that this may not have been his plan A right now, but I think ultimately this was his plan A.
Yeah, I'll agree with all those points. I might not fully agree with Josh that it was time, but I'll agree with Mitch that this was probably 2 years away from happening.
Yeah.
So
it's an accelerated sort of end destination. Yeah, I think so.
But I also believe Pete Carroll deserves. I'm not going, how, like, more recognition. There are certain teams, other sports around, primarily in baseball, where like big legends get a statue outside the stadium. And I think Pete Carroll is in that discussion. He deserves that type of legend status and credit for years beyond. So more than just a Ring of Honor name, I think that there should be Pete Carroll once he's done. After he's done being an advisor and he's rode off into the sunset. I would love the Seahawks to dedicate something, maybe the
instead of the Virginia Madsen, we could call it the Pete Carroll Training Center.
Well, they're still a sponsor, so it could be like the VMAC Pete Carroll practice facility, something like that. I think he's reached that status. We've brought up other names when it came to coaches, and I made a list, and these are just the guys I thought of off the top of my head. And so let's run through these, and then if you guys have any additional names, let's kind of throw those out afterwards. I think I have 9 that I thought of. Yes.
Josh coming in with the zingers.
Just do the statue with Bobby standing next to Pete instead of Russ, right? Take that image and then just kind of slide Bobby in there.
Josh is just chiming in with great stuff here. Robbie, you want to talk about coach? I guess, do you want to start this discussion, Rob? Because I know you said you had a list. And obviously, Mitch and I, when I say Mitch and I mean Mitch. We'll have some other names, I'm sure. I'm just going to comment on the names you guys mentioned, unless there's 2 obvious ones that I'm thinking of that you guys aren't. But I don't see that happening. So go ahead, Rob.
All right. These are in no particular order, I guess, except for the top 2. And you mentioned it, and I think Dan Quinn is probably the top choice before they even start interviews. Right. He's got a top 5 defense in Dallas. He has a history in Seattle. He was the defensive coordinator for both Super Bowl appearances there in that Legion of Boom era. So he's been successful in Seattle. He's been successful everywhere he went, except for at the end of his Falcons tenure. So I think it goes without saying that he's a top candidate, and probably one of the guys who I would prefer they hire, without looking at the full list of people they intend to interview, obviously.
Yeah.
Mitch, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say about Quinn. I think if you're in the school of thought that they made this decision now because of the availability of certain outstanding candidates, top of that list of outstanding candidates is a guy that was involved in our greatest couple of seasons in franchise history. He also was in charge of the area of our franchise that currently needs the most work. Arguably, but our defense for the last 6 years has been basement dwelling. Yeah. So
you're not wrong.
It seems like if you're making this decision now, and it did come out of nowhere, it possibly is because the Panthers are already requested to interview him, right? And was it the Titans as well? There are 2 teams that have already inquired. I think it was the Titans.
Sounds right.
It was the Titans. Yeah. Okay. And for all we know, maybe the Falcons will as well, right? So there are already people circling.
Well, that would be really funny if the Falcons requested Dan Quinn.
Get him back in there.
Hey, Dan, would you have any interest in coaching the Falcons? I don't know if you know this. I was the coach of the Falcons. Yeah, look, I think if with Pete Carroll still at least, and yes, I'm going to use the word, ostensibly being part of the organization moving forward, even in whatever capacity that happens to be, I think that you need to start and end your search, in my opinion, with the Pete Carroll coaching tree. Now that's a pretty big tree. It's not just Dan Quinn and the other 2 guys that used to be our defensive coordinators before Clint Hurt.
Ken Norton and Gus Bradley.
Thank you. It's not just those guys. And I think if we were just going to look at those 3 guys, obviously Dan Quinn would be the only one I would really want to consider for a head coaching gig, just because we've seen him have success outside the coaching tree. We really haven't seen that. Well, I mean, again, those guys may have had some success coaching defensive, but I don't know if neither one of them have had any success as a head coach. But I do think that if we want to continue with the philosophy that Pete Carroll brought here, the discussion needs to start and end with Pete Carroll coaching tree. Now there's plenty of guys that are college coaches and college head coaches and coordinators that have all worked under Pete in some capacity over the years. The man has a pretty wide reach, having been in this league and around the league for 50 years. So yes, I know we're going to talk about a lot of names, but for me, Dan Quinn is number one with a bullet, and then there's a giant gap to any other guy that isn't part of the Pete Carroll coaching tree for me.
All right. Well, Josh chimed in with his thoughts on Dan Quinn.
You're wrong, Josh.
Says, Dan Quinn is probably top of the list, but we don't want a Carroll disciple. Let's move forward, get an offensive head coach who employs a top defensive coordinator and lets them do their thing. I think that's pretty direct, and I might disagree with you, Josh, but I can see the merit in that approach.
I do disagree with you, Josh, but I do see the merit in that approach.
I'd like to chime in on that. Actually, I'm going to side slightly with Josh. I know that my allegiances are right there with him, but I do see the fact that defensive coordinators for our franchise have been internal promotions for a long time, and I think a lot of people are ready to see a new mind on our defensive coordination. So the idea of taking someone with fresh ideas and getting someone in who isn't internally promoted, someone who is, from the outside brought in, I completely see the appeal of that. For me, I want to see some of our identity retained, so I completely get the Pete Carroll tree thing, but I can also see that flip that Josh is coming from there, 100%.
So I guess, and I know this is not, I'm not the host, and I should probably just text this to Robbie so he can ask the question, but I do want to make a point of, I understand the discussion, and Josh, you can chime in on the text line for this as well. What is it about Pete Carroll that we want to get away from? The winning philosophy, the championships, the consistency, the
always compete,
the fun. I mean, what is it we want to go away from? I understand wanting to move forward. I don't think that I don't think that bringing in a guy like Dan Quinn is not moving. Unagi. Way to throw the Friends reference, Josh. I don't see that there's an issue bringing in a Pete Carroll disciple. Dan Quinn is going to bring in his own guys. I don't think he's going to call up Gus Bradley or Clint Hurt and say, "Hey, come be part of my staff." I think he's going to bring his own philosophy. We've already seen when he moved to Atlanta that he brought in his own guys to do stuff. It's not like he's just going to be a Pete Carroll carbon copy. Dan Quinn's a different guy. He's got a different philosophy. I still think he's going to have some of that Pete Carroll philosophy with him, but I don't see the downside of bringing in a guy like Dan Quinn who knows the team, knows the organization, knows the philosophy that Pete Carroll, the winning philosophy that Pete Carroll instilled.
Yeah, I think that's, like I said, I see merits on both sides of that argument.
Me too.
So then, you could say, if you want to keep it in that same tree, you have the Gus Bradley and the Ken Norton would be names that were out there. Of the two, as much as I like Gus Bradley, I would probably rather them interview Ken Norton and stay on that side. He's maintained more success throughout his career, and he has been noted by past players, mainly KJ Wright, as being that type of coach who will set a player straight for things, which discipline is something that was lacking this past season.
Absolutely.
With DK Metcalf and his personal fouls that he was getting, when Metcalf was applauding JSN for getting an unsportsmanlike conduct penalty, for Tariq Woolen not putting effort in and tackling, to Woolen grabbing his manhood at the end of the Cardinals game. Right?
Come on. That was clearly a nod to beast mode. I had no problem with
it. I didn't have a problem with it either, but it was.
I don't think it was a nod to beast mode. I'm just kidding,
but I thought it was funny, to be honest. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's funny in the moment, but it's a bad look from a macro view. So there's something to be said about, we have a young team. Maybe we need more of a hard line coach. So I think that's where Ken Norton would kind of fill that role, but still bring that Seahawks competitive and having fun culture to the table, kind of bridging both worlds.
I mean, Ken Norton took a lot of heat before he left. There was a lot of people,
Yeah, clearly he wasn't the issue. But...
No.
No, yeah, quite.
So that I wasn't going to talk about Gus Bradley a ton. We just kind of brought him up, so I threw him in there. So for me, I think somebody who I'd like to at least get an interview, because I think this coach has been undervalued in the NFL, and that is Eric Bieniemy.
I thought you were going somewhere else with that.
Yeah, the former offensive coordinator for the Chiefs, who spent this past season with the Commanders and really got the absolute most out of a very weak Commanders offense. They overperformed offensively this year, and I think all the credit goes to Bieniemy on that one.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised to see, sorry, Mitch, I didn't mean to jump in on
No,
it.
you go.
I wouldn't be surprised to see for him to be the first candidate for the Commanders head coaching vacancy. But yeah, no, I think Bieniemy could be a great pick. I mean, if the idea is to, as Josh says, move on and start fresh, then I think bringing in an offensive-minded head coach is a pretty great way to do that, and bringing in someone who's clearly shown that he can get the best out of his players, no matter what the Commanders are a pretty sloppy organization. Have been through more turmoil than probably most organizations not named the Jets.
They're on their way out. They're good.
Yeah. I mean, are they? But yeah, I know. I look. There are very few names that I'm sure you're going to mention that I will have a direct problem with. There's one name that I have a problem with that I know you're going to bring up, and it's only because as much as this guy is a great head coach, I hate his guts. And I hate his guts. Look, it's part of the era that is this Seahawk era, and I just don't look. I know we're going to talk about him in a minute, so I'm not going to say his name, but when we do,
why don't you say his name? Because I don't have any more Seahawks era coaches on my list.
His name is John. Sorry, his name is Jim Harbaugh. The current coach of the NCAA National Championship Michigan Wolverines and former coach of our NFC West hated rivals, the San Francisco 49ers. That's a name that's been blowing up on Twitter. Yes, I'm going to still call it Twitter. Seahawks Twitter especially over the last several minutes as my phone has been going off and I had to turn off my notifications because I keep getting them because I follow way too many people. But that's the only look. Would I mind if they interviewed him? No, just as long as they ended the interview with thanks, we won't be calling. So that's the one coach I don't want. Just it can't be Harbaugh. That's all that's all I ask, Jodi Allen. I won't ask you for anything else as long as you're the owner of my team. Just don't hire Jim Harbaugh.
Like it.
All right.
Keith, just back to Bieniemy. I like the idea of going with an offensive orientated head coach, just because I feel like you're going to get less interference with the defensive scheme potentially. And I feel like that's been, since we've had Pete and whoever he's internally appointed, I feel like there's been a bit of a, I don't want to call it like a short leash for the defensive coordinators, because I do feel like they really get to put their stamp on what we do, and it is their scheme. But I do feel like Pete Carroll has had a lot of say in the way that we shape our defensive scheme. And to have an offensive head coach would be really refreshing if it was offensive head coach, bring in a guy, let him do his thing. Someone they believe in, let him do his thing. And, you know, that would be refreshing from a Seahawks point of view to have it that way around for me.
Well, there could be no more offensive head coach for me than Jim Harbaugh.
Outstanding. So
I'm sorry, I couldn't resist.
It would be a very refreshing thing to have an offensive head coach, my offensive minded head coach. But defense does win championships. And I know it's a cliche, it's said, but it's true. it's out there for a reason. I like having a defensive-minded head coach. Now, and you could say the change, basically what you just said about the defensive coordinators in Seattle, but Pete Carroll giving up control of the defense is why Pete Carroll is no longer with the Seattle Seahawks as head coach, because he knew that 4-3 over cover 3 system, he basically developed it, right? So he knew every aspect of it. If something was wrong, he could go to the chalkboard and say, we need to fix this and this. And then they could fix what was going on. It wasn't his system. The Fangio 3-4 is not what Pete Carroll was strong in. So he just had to kind of hit the I believe button and say, okay, Clint Hurt and whoever else was there, Sean Desai or whoever was helping out this year, go fix it. And so I think a lot of that is why he's gone, is because he did transfer some of that control on the defensive side of the ball and went with a trendy defense, which in my learned opinion is not effective.
A trendy defense that we saw get destroyed multiple times in championship games, I might add. Yeah, look, I 100% agree that if Pete Carroll had taken more of a hand and made some changes, he might still be here. I don't, we're not there behind the scenes. We don't exactly know what happened, but it did seem like Pete was putting faith in his two coordinators to fix the issues that were there. And clearly he was not rewarded for that faith. But the reason that Pete Carroll is no longer the head coach is because we took a step back this year. You can say that we, or at the very least, we were stagnant 2 years in a row. There were no changes. And I don't know, again, who knows what Pete Carroll would have done going forward were he still the head coach. But I don't think, having watched Pete Carroll for 14 years, unless Shane Waldron or Clint Hurt wanted to move on themselves, I think we would have started the 2024 NFL season with Pete Carroll as head coach and those two as our coordinators. And that would have been, for my money, disastrous.
Yeah, I agree. The idea of those three being at the helm at the beginning of next year would flatten a lot of people's enthusiasm. And I do, whilst the seasons, when you line them up, are remarkably similar, there is a lot of problems that existed last year that just had not been addressed sufficiently. So the idea, like you say, of going into a third season with the same people at the helm, that wasn't a good look for the fan base.
Untenable.
I had hoped that Waldron would be, moved to a different role or moved on from, but
you got your wish. He will definitely be in a different role next season.
Yeah. All right. So
couch potato, hopefully.
So my top two candidates are Dan Quinn and Eric Bieniemy. Those are the two that I really want to see get interviews and guys that I would be stoked if either of them came in. These are guys who are interesting prospects from either a popular kind of name who's out in the market or somebody who I think could be interesting for the team. So here's one, Kellen Moore.
I knew you were going to fucking say.
Former offensive coordinator for the Cowboys, current offensive coordinator for the Chargers with Pacific Northwest ties. He's already interviewed for the Chargers head coaching job. So he's sort of already in the process around the league of his name being up for jobs. I don't think he's ready for a head coaching job, but he's somebody who would be interesting in that he's one of the younger names on this list. He's somebody who, if you hit on this coach, could be, huge, could be there for 20 years and be just a steady name, which is one of my negatives against Harbaugh coming in, is why do you move on from your 72-year-old coach to then go hire a 60-year-old coach? How many years are you going to get?
I mean, I think it would be a very interesting dichotomy to move on from the oldest head coach in the league to what would be the youngest head coach, I believe, if Kellen Moore gets hired as a head coach. Yeah. I mean, one of, if not the youngest. I'm trying to. He's certainly younger than Bieniemy. I don't know who else you have on the names on the list that's in their early 30s. What My fear would be, one, yes, I do think he's a little inexperienced. He's clearly shown that well, I shouldn't say clearly because that Chargers offense was a disaster this year.
That wasn't all on him.
No, I'm not saying it was, but I think, I mean, this is look.
Part of that was who they drafted in the first round.
Sure, that was of all the wide receivers taken, that was the worst. The NFL is a "what have you done for me lately" league. If he was coming off what looked like a successful coaching job with the Cowboys, and the Cowboys had taken a step back offensively, Ben Johnson, by the way, is the name that Josh is throwing out.
He's 37.
Okay, so Kellen Moore is 37.
No, Ben Johnson is.
Okay, I was gonna say I think Kellen Moore is like 34, maybe 33. But we already saw that I'm not saying that he didn't have something to do with the success of that the Cowboys have seen on offense over the last several years, but clearly they didn't take a step back when he left for Los Angeles. So I don't know how there's no way for me to tell directly how much of that was Kellen Moore and how much of that was just a great offensive scheme or how much of that was talented players. I think they have talented players in Los Angeles, but he couldn't make the most out of those guys. I don't have a ton of faith that he can make the most out of the Seahawks roster, especially coming into a role where he's going to be making those kind of decisions. Now, I could be wrong, and maybe head coaching is where he needs to be. Maybe he's just not a great play caller. Maybe, again, he's an offensive mind similar to Shane Waldron where he can come up with a great scheme, but he needs someone else to implement it. I would want to reserve judgment on a guy like that, or even Ben Johnson, whose name I know is coming up later, because of these young guys coming in. It would depend who they brought in to be their coordinators. If they bring in experienced play callers, people that have years and years of experience in those positions, which is what they should do as a young head coach, then I might have no problem with that. But if it's a situation where they're bringing in their buddies, I'm going to have an issue.
Yeah, the name that I really wanted to put out there from a sort of fantasy perspective was DeBoer from UW, because he'd done a fantastic job piecing together that roster and getting the most out of some serious talents, and he's a bit of a hometown name now as well. And as you mentioned before we went on air, Robbie, he'd been offered a large contract from UW, very, very competitive, if not blowing NFL contracts out of the water to try and keep him there. So there's obviously a huge amount of buy-in from UW for him to sort of take over that regime for as long as they can keep him. I would love to see a Michael Penix and maybe a Polk or a Dunze and DeBoer coming in and really igniting that offense and that from a real sort of fantasy sort of look at it. I think that would be a really fun. I mean, it's only fun if you're winning, but be a fun way to see that sort of unfold.
Well, if they announce that DeBoer is coming over or signed as the Seahawks head coach, then I guarantee you that one or more offensive players from Washington are going to be a Seahawks after the draft. I think that the asking price for Michael Penix goes up considerably, and we'll probably have to trade one or more future picks to get him. Because sitting at 16 right now, I mean, yes, is it possible Michael Penix falls to 16? Sure it is. It's possible he falls out of the first round. Not likely, but it's possible. But I would say if that happens, then I think everyone's going to assume that we're drafting Michael Penix, and everyone's going to try and stop us from doing it.
Yeah, I think it's a fair shout.
And something else that a move like that would do is the DeBoer signing, and then, in a perfect world, then getting Penix to join him would really kind of galvanize that fan base, those fans that are both Washington and Seattle Seahawks fans.
Yeah, there's tons of positives.
But I don't think, and I was saying this before because this name kind of came up while we were waiting to go live. I don't know if he'd do it. The NFL changes coaches very quickly, and yes, it's the top league. It's the number one highest professional league out there, and you'd think that would be the pinnacle. But in college, coaches get paid more at the top schools, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
They get paid more and they have more job security. It takes a lot more to get fired as a college head coach than it does to get fired as an NFL head coach. So DeBoer would be looking
control.
Well, yeah, and you have a lot more control. So he would be looking at this contract from Washington, long-term deal. They basically said that the deal would be they would make him a Huskies head coach until he chose to retire and walk off into the sunset. Like it was one of those just record-breaking, take this money, go build your perfect house and grow old there. And so that's really tough to turn down if you're a coach. And I don't think an NFL franchise could persuade him away from a deal such as that.
Yeah, the Seahawks would have their work cut out for him, I think, to win him away from UW. But again, it is there is that allure. I mean, he's never coached in the NFL. Now, if this was a guy like Nick Saban or somebody who's already had an opportunity to coach in the NFL and whether successful or not chooses to go back, I don't know DeBoer personally. I've never met him. I've seen him in a few press conferences and I've certainly heard him on the radio. But I don't know if he's that kind of guy. I know that there are people out there who want to challenge themselves, want to see what they can, want to push themselves to see what they can do next. Can they get better? Can they do things like that? If he's that kind of guy, then I think that it won't take quite as much to get him away from UW. If it's I want the challenge of coaching in the NFL, I want to take what I've learned and move forward. But in this world, security trumps pretty much all. So. Yeah, I agree, Rob. That's a pretty tough ask for the Seahawks to put it up on the table for him to want to walk away.
All right. Looking at some other names. I know we brought up Ben Johnson, so we can just talk about Ben Johnson. Current Lions offensive coordinator. He's one of the hot young names floating around right now. Some people think maybe he needs another year or two with the Lions. Other people are ready to bring him in for a coaching interview now in this cycle. 37 years old, has had great success. In fact, Josh put out a little, Adam, do you want to throw that up from the comments? His opinions on Ben Johnson. So he said, Lions offensive coordinator, young, working wonders with Jared Goff, who we saw in LA as having a downturn. Everybody thought Jared Goff's career was destined to be bust that sits the bench for the last part as somebody's number two. And he's
the Lions basically gave an extra pick just so they would take Goff.
Yeah. And it turned out to be great for them. So Ben Johnson's been working wonders with Goff. He schemes well and knows how to use his weapons in inventive ways. I think that's a great assessment by Josh. I think he would be a very interesting hire. Another guy who maybe wouldn't be the top of my list, but I would be intrigued to see what would happen if the Seahawks do go ahead and hire him. So yeah, I am of a positive view of Ben Johnson.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to argue what he's done since taking over the Lions offense. I mean, the resurgence of Jared Goff, obviously, the Lions have been one of the hottest teams over the last couple of years. They missed the playoffs last year, but make it this year. They actually won the NFC North, what I think was like the first time in 40 years or something like that. And they are legit. I think they are a legit Super Bowl contender. To represent the NFC. So yeah, I mean, if this is all about going with a hot hand or just again, this is a what we've done for me lately league. Ben Johnson has certainly done a lot lately.
Yeah, I really like the angle that Josh has come from there with really getting the most out of the players that were there, because he seems to have overachieved with some players in terms of what the consensus of, the consensus, like you say, Robbie, of how good Goff was going to be in that system. He's dramatically overshot what you would expect him to be able to get out of that. And I really think that our offense is equipped with enough high quality weapons to do far more, especially in the red zone and on third downs, than it has done in the last few years. It's definitely equipped for someone to just unlock it. A talent like that, I would, looking at the job that's been done there with the Lions, I would back them to get more there. So yeah, no, I think that's a great take, and that would excite me. It would be interesting. Not necessarily the way I would want us to go, but if it happened, like you, I'd watch it with a lot of interest.
And then if we just stick with the Lions, Lions defensive coordinator Aaron Glenn has also been getting a lot of buzz out in the coaching world. And so he will interview multiple times this cycle. I'm not sure if anybody's going to pull the trigger. Obviously, he's going to need to, nail those interviews and whatnot. But he is somebody who, once again, I prefer a defensive-minded head coach. So he's somebody who fits that bill. He's a 4 down front guy, which I also like. Get rid of this scheme that's not working and go back to something efficient. But yeah, I like Aaron Glenn. Plus he brings some locker room respect to the table that this young team may need, in being a former player himself.
Yeah. I think Pete's always given players so much free rein to express themselves and allow their personalities to shine through, and not feel inhibited with having to rein it in and not express. Pete's always been very big on that, and I think to a certain extent there is a bit too much of that right now with the way some of the newest recruits are behaving and expressing themselves. I know I said I found it funny with the crotch grab, but I think when you put it in context of what that win was, how clutch it was against the opponent that we played, in the circumstances, and missing out on the playoffs, to behave like that, it showed a real lack of respect, and it also showed a lack of understanding for what the franchise's expectations are of what success means to the franchise. So I think someone like that would be good. I think there is a sort of line to strike there with the discipline.
All right, John Ryan.
Josh kind of agrees with you there on the woolen gesture. So
I'll just say this.
What I will say, sorry, John Ryan, he made a comment about the cigar smoking as well, and I think the context of that being related to J-Love's
birth of his son.
The birth of his son. I actually really like that they paid the respect of waiting until our season was over before they had a cigar together in the locker room. I think for a lot of people it looked like they were celebrating the season and what we'd achieved, which was absolutely nothing. With that context applied to it, I've got absolutely no problems with sharing a cigar.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and it's kind of funny. I'm going back and rewatching the first season of Ted Lasso with my girl because she's never seen it, and I just thought that the similarities between Coach Pete and Ted Lasso, and then obviously in the first, for those of you that don't know, in the first season of Ted Lasso, they have a party in the locker room after a loss, and one player has a real problem with it and says something to the media, and the media kind of blows it out of proportion, celebrating after a loss. And it wasn't that. There was a player that had a birthday. They were celebrating the player's birthday. That's kind of where I saw this as. I'll just say this. I don't think that the crotch grab was disrespectful from Mullen. I think it was immature.
Okay.
And he's a young player. I'm not making excuses for him. Certainly, you got to realize where you're at and who you are, and the fact that that's going to end up out there and people are going to take it however they want. Doesn't matter how you mean it. The same thing with the cigars in the locker room. It doesn't matter what you. I mean, yes, context matters, but in the media world or social media world, context doesn't matter at all. Everyone's gonna see the picture and make their own judgments on it, as John Ryan did. John Ryan, Seahawks great, I should say. I'm gonna put a little respect on his name because we do love John Ryan. But yeah, I agree. I didn't see an issue with it in the context that it was in. So
yeah. All right, I'm going to throw a few names out. We've been going a while, so obviously Mike Vrabel is going to be a name that's mentioned. I think he fits better in New England, regardless of what happens up in New England. I don't necessarily want him coaching the Seahawks, but he is the name that's out there. And Josh mentioned it. earlier when we jumped on, he was like, "Oh, don't do it! Don't you dare say Vrabel." But he will be in the conversation. Listen, he won Coach of the Year. What, just 3 years ago? Came in and turned that Titans franchise around, and then they just had a couple down years. So
yeah, that to me was the most surprising coach firing of this offseason, because Vrabel, he's been there 6 seasons. They've got to the playoffs for 4 seasons. They were in the AFC Championship just 2 years ago. He's shown that he can still, bring along young players in the franchise and draft pretty well. I think that that's an organization that's still set up pretty well for the future with how they've drafted the last couple of seasons. So yeah, that was pretty shocking to me. I would be shocked if the Seahawks didn't interview Vrabel. No, I don't want him. Yes, I would prefer he was in New England. But I wouldn't be upset if he was named as the Seahawks, the new head coach. Disappointed, but not upset.
Yeah, and there were rumors of strained relationship there between him and ownership, and other front office personnel. So it was more of a relationship reason than a coaching reason. Sort of like how Wink Martindale is no longer the defensive coordinator of the Giants as of today. The franchise decided to fire his top 2 guys. Like they move around to the jobs as a package, and he was not brought in on that decision. So he actually had some very spicy words for Brian Daboll in a team meeting yesterday, which was reported on, and which ended with him storming out. And so today they decided to part ways. So, it's awful nice of franchise there to let the only effective unit of their team coordinator walk out, but it happens. And so relationships do drive some of these coaching changes. That was the whole Brian Flores in Florida thing. It was all relationship driven. So there may have been some other elements. I'm not going to get into that, but you might see more coaches go due to relationship, unlike the Pete Carroll move, which they felt they had to make the move despite having the relationship. So just something to look at. Let's see. Leslie Frazier is still a name that's brought up. I liked what he did when he was with the Vikings. He's a guy who I respect, defensive minded, former player, plays a system that I think the Seattle Seahawks fans would like watching, and has respect in the league. So that's my last defensive guy. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on Leslie Frazier. He's not an older coach, but he's not one of the young guns. He's going to be in that mid tier.
I think when you look at what Pete said today in his press conference about the marriage that he'd had with John Schneider and that commitment they'd had to each other, and I think when you look through the candidates that we've listed, that's one that I could see being a reasonable match with Schneider. Vrabel, absolutely not. I don't see that being a sort of symbiotic relationship where they feed off each other's positivity and create it. I don't see the Vrabel thing being a good match with Schneider, but
or the city.
Yeah, certainly. Sorry,
or the city.
Yeah, maybe not. And like you said, I think that's got Patriots written all over it. I think that's I think that one's set in stone. But yeah, there are some that you've mentioned that I think are really good fits for John Schneider to work with. And I think that's a really, really key. I think that's such a key factor in who we appoint. I think that's going to be the biggest factor, who John Schneider thinks that he can, marry up with and have another 14 years of success with. So that's my take.
Anybody else have a name that they like? Mine's Jim Harbaugh. Or were they just like, no? There's a lot of people out there.
I'd also personally hate the Harbaugh thing. Just no for me. It just turns my stomach.
I would hate it, but I could see it from a coaching aspect. But I wouldn't bring Harbaugh in to our current situation. If I was in charge of hiring for a franchise that was basically in ruin, that needed structure, that needed somebody with his prestige to come in, then that's when I would probably bring a Harbaugh in. I don't think he fits in Seattle, and I'm trying to remove my personal opinion out of it. And a lot of that's just from the rivalry years.
Well, he's already said his favorite color is black. My guess is he's going to be interviewing with the Las Vegas Raiders shortly.
Yeah. I do not think he'll be at Michigan next year. So I think he will be in the NFL. I just do not think he'll be with the Seahawks.
Let's hope. Touch wood.
Shane Waldron, anybody? Shane Waldron is.
I don't want Schottenheimer either, by the way. Just he can stay away.
I'm fine with that. Schottenheimer, I could be talked into. Shane Waldron, I don't want to see as the head coach. Though I will say he will make a better head coach than an offensive coordinator. But I think he needs to.
It's not a hard bar. That's not a very high bar to clear, buddy.
But the thing is, he is talked about in coaching circles as being a good offensive coordinator. And I'm curious what games these people have been watching, because he does have a good offensive mind.
I think they're confused, and they were watching Rams games when he was the tight ends coach. They're confused.
But I could see him getting interviews to be somebody else's offensive coordinator. And if he does well there, he could be a head coach. He's not ready, nor do I think informed fans want to see that with the Seahawks.
Fair point.
I have one name. It is a long shot, not long shot. It is a out of left field sort of person, somebody who definitely doesn't have the coordinator time to be coming in for a head coaching gig. But what about the return of former quarterbacks coach for the Seahawks and current Buccaneers offensive coordinator, Dave Canales? He is somebody who is respected within the organization. He got the best out of Geno Smith when he was the quarterbacks coach, when Geno Smith had that career year last year.
Season.
So bringing somebody like that in to get the most that you possibly can out of Geno Smith while you draft a young quarterback and develop him behind for a couple of years could kind of take that. He could be a young version of like an Andy Reid who came in as that quarterback guru, offensive mind. Just somebody I was thinking maybe out in left field that could be a sneaky interview at least.
Yeah, sure. Look, if it's not going to be Dan Quinn, then Dave Canales is my number 2. It's a distance. There's a distance there, but he's my number 2. So
I'd be really disappointed if we didn't interview him, because at least extend him an interview, because he was so highly thought of when he left us, and I think if Pete's got any say, and we assume he will because of the position they put him in, if Pete's got any say on who they throw an invitation for an interview to, I would love to see him just come in and get that opportunity to interview for a head coaching role, because I think that's in his future. Whether it's now is another question, but it's in his future, and you'd like to think that having such a good reputation so locally to us, I just want to see that extended to him, and you never know, he might blow them away, and it might happen. Yeah. I can see why you say it's a long shot, but I love that it's come up.
Yeah, I mean, he left to get experience, and
he got it. I mean, his team's in the playoffs, so
he is the reason that Baker Mayfield will be in the NFL next year.
That's 2 years in a row, by the way, that he's pulled the masterstroke in quarterback whispering.
Yeah. So something to look at there. Quarterback gurus get opportunities earlier than other coaches. So you saw that with, oh my gosh, why is his name? Doug Peterson, I believe, got an opportunity earlier than he probably should have. Though he made the most of his opportunities. I'm not holding anything against him.
Nick Foles is a championship winning quarterback because of Doug Peterson.
Yep, 100%. All right. So Josh gave us his 100% no-go coach that he does not want. And that's Adam. We clicked it at the same time. All right.
I noticed.
And that is Bill Belichick. Josh says that man should never step foot in Lumen Field again. So, pretty strong words there, Josh, but I'm going to agree with you, but not for the same reasons, probably. I just don't think you go from 70-year-old coach to 70-year-old coach.
Yeah, I mean, where does I know this is completely off topic, but where is Bill Belichick coaching next season?
High school, hopefully.
Yeah, so that's exactly what I was going to say. Some high school in New England.
I was going to say not the NFL. That's my only.
Yep, Foxborough High School.
If he gets let go by the Patriots, or they have a mutual parting of the ways, which will be the parlance, I have no doubt. I don't think he coaches next year. Do I think he'll still be back in the NFL? Possibly. Someone's going to offer him a ton of money to try and come back, but I think he's going to take at least a year off.
I wonder if the Pete Carroll situation that's unfolded today might start some cogs turning in New England as well, because they always pull up the two, don't they, alongside each other with the tenure they've had and the sort of the peak successes they've had and the sort of timelines there. I can see them absolutely considering, if they're not already, a way to amicably, part ways there.
I can't. I agree. I couldn't see them wanting him to stay in the fold with the franchise, just because the knock on Bill Belichick has been his ability to draft and develop players not named Tom Brady, especially of late. I mean, he is the GM. He's the ultimate guy there, making every decision, and that clearly, since Brady, hasn't really been a thing that's worked out for them. So I would be shocked if they were like, yeah, he's going to maintain his position as a GM or head of player personnel, but we're going to get a new head coach.
So he's said that he's willing to give up the GM duties to remain as head coach. Basically like, oh, I'm spreading myself too thin. Like, let's take care of the personnel side. I think what needs to happen is he needs to move on from both, but maybe be in that vice president of football operations sort of role, so he can have more of an advisory role. I think that
he can
might
still be
a
in the
better
draft
fit
room.
for him. Yeah,
he can still be in the draft room and still, I think he's still got years of being a great consultant to that franchise and keeping them on track with recruitment and everything. I think that's absolutely where you'd want him to be. But you also, again, like our situation with Pete, you also wouldn't want that to undermine the new mind and new ideas that you'd want to bring in with a new head coach. So
I do have one problem, and this will be if they move on from Bill Belichick, a situation in New England, but it's also the exact same situation in Seattle. And that's, if there's advice that's given at every single level of coaching, doesn't matter where you're at, it's you never want to follow a legend. You never want to be the next guy, because
I was going to mention this earlier when you mentioned the statue. I said definitely don't start building the Pete Carroll statue while the new head coach is coming in, because nobody needs to see that.
That leads me into actually, I was wondering. I was going to. I know we've been doing this. This is not pretty long. It's been over an hour now, but I do wonder, what do you guys think Pete Carroll's role is going to be going forward, and what do you hope his role is going forward? Because that's going to be, I mean, that is going to have a huge impact on everything the Seahawks do moving forward. How much influence does Pete Carroll still have in the building?
Oof. I would like Pete Carroll to still have an influence going forward, as far as his culture, keeping things light and encouraging. Well, I'm going to say people, because he's that way with his coaching staff as well. He lifts up all people that he's around, which is a mark of a good coach. So I'd love for him to have some influence in culture. I mean, the man is still a football genius. So some element of football operations, but he does need to let the new coach be the coach. So it's tough. Maybe in his relationship with John Schneider, having influence there in front office sort of decisions, and not even decisions, but just having his influence there, somebody to bounce ideas off of, to provide that viewpoint, I think is where he would be best for the franchise. And I think he'll probably be in that role, and it'll slowly kind of phase out, which I hate to see, but I think that's what's going to happen.
Yeah, I think whatever it ends up being established as this year coming, I think that will diminish over time. But when you look at the draft classes we've put together and the emphasis we put on character traits and really doing our due diligence into drafting the person as well as the talent, I'd love to see him be part of not necessarily a scouting role, but being in highlighting and helping to sort of break down prospects that we're looking at in the draft. Granted, the head coach and Schneider will be picking the players that are available on the board. They're not going to go to Pete and say, "Who would you pick, Pete?" But
at least not during the draft, hopefully.
Yeah, but there's so much work that goes into plotting players and working out who is a first round, second round, third round talent, and picking out certain players to really get into at the combine. And I'd love to see him still involved in sort of that sort of area of scouting. I'd love for that to be.
Yeah, I think my fear, just to kind of throw in my 2 cents on my own question, because I love to hear myself talk. My fear is that we're going to end up with a Bruce Arians in Tampa Bay situation. I don't know. I mean, it's been a year now. Maybe you guys don't remember it so much, but Bruce Arians was in every meeting, on the sidelines on game day, and it was a big talking point for not just fans but the TV personalities. I mean, every game there was always a shot of Bruce Arians on the sideline. Every game in Tampa Bay, and I do think that was a big reason why Tampa Bay didn't repeat as Super Bowl champions, because that's a big distraction, and I just don't want that. I think that is going to be the worst thing they could do is have Pete Carroll still be there as much as he is now, in the meetings and having that kind of just, we don't need him. He can still be there every game day if he wants, up in a box with Jodi Allen, but I just don't want to see him down on the field.
I don't want to see him. Like, that sounds horrible, because I'm still feeling really, not upset, but I'm feeling emotional about the fact that he's not going to be our head coach anymore. But I do feel like if we're moving on from him, if I start seeing him, with the defensive, if he's sat next to Clint Hurt, when we see those shots of Clint Hurt in the box, I'm going to worry about that. So, and I don't want to see him on the sideline either. I want to know that he's there. I want to know that he has an impact, but I don't want to see him involved in every day-to-day thing. I want him to spend some time with his wife, to be honest.
Well, I mean, he mentioned her during the press conference a lot.
Yeah,
just for point of reference, Mitch, I doubt we're going to be seeing a lot of shots of Clint Hurt during Seahawks games anymore, because I don't think Clint Hurt's going to be part of the staff.
Yeah, no, granted, but yeah, that's my take. If we start seeing him everywhere, like with Arians, I think something's gone very wrong in that process. I want to know that he's there. I'd ideally like to feel that he's there with some of the recruitment and with the draft process, but I don't want to see him all the time, because we want to be moving on. That's where I am.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. As much as I love Pete Carroll, advise, don't distract.
Yes.
And I think you nailed it with Arians there, Adam. All right. So as we wrap this up, it is worth noting, because you guys just mentioned Clint Hurt, the Seahawks did put out information that the new coach has full autonomy over their staff. There is nobody who is guaranteed a position on the coaching staff next year. In fact, all coaches have been given full reign to seek other opportunities. Mm-hmm. So it may be a full
reset
on
the coaching staff.
That'll make Josh happy.
It didn't make Pete happy, though. He was very emotional about that. That was one of his biggest moments that he struggled with, was the uncertainty for the coaches and their families, and the people that have felt like they'd be in Seattle for a few years now, and the families could settle down there, and then suddenly this potentially uproots all of them, and that is the very human side of this, isn't it? That we're talking about potential new people coming in and what Pete's done. There is a whole lot of people that potentially get unearthed and moved here. So, yeah.
And I think really I agree, and I love that about Pete. And that was what hit me most during the press conference, because I think that's what hit Pete the hardest too. That's when I started choking up. But I do think that may be the very reason why he's not the head coach anymore, because of his reluctance to make those hard, his attachment and difficulty. And because I think it was very difficult for him to make any decision where he moved on from a player and or member of staff. And I love that about Pete. I do, but I think Pete, Seahawks were a family first and a business second for Pete. And as much as I love that about him, that's not conducive to the way the NFL works currently.
No,
it's not.
And I think whoever comes in and replaces Pete will probably wield the axe on Jamal Adams, whereas Pete was making a lot of noises. Jamal Adams was with us next year, and I think someone else coming in would look at that cap hit, look at the £16 million saving after June 1st, and say, "I'll take the 16 million, thank you. Take a free agent, allow Jamal Adams to pay for our draft class." I don't see him staying with the new coach. Maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, no, I agree. I was actually just going to say, Rob, do you want to go into that now, or should we save that?
We should probably save that.
Our season recap.
And Mitch, you're more than welcome to come on for that as well.
Yeah, I've got some opinions.
Yeah, I do think that will be something we discuss, is who do we see still part of the team and not part of the team moving forward. I know I've got some names on my list that are going to make me upset and probably everybody else, but I do think we're going to see maybe not the same number of moves that John Schneider and Pete Carroll made when they first came into the organization, but I do think we're going to see a fairly significant number of moves this offseason now that the first domino has fallen.
Definitely.
Very good.
All right, as we wrap up, do you gentlemen have any last words on the end of this era, the Pete Carroll era here in Seattle?
I'd like to just say a thank you, really, to Pete. Pete, if you're listening, thank you. I actually tweeted out thank you for everything that you've given, and thank you for everything that you'll continue to give to the city of Seattle through your culture, because he is not only the greatest coach in our history in terms of, he's won a Super Bowl no one else has, so by default I believe he's the most successful, but also in Seattle sports he is the leading lights in terms of coach tenure and success, and he put Seattle on the sporting map in a lot of ways. So there's an awful lot that he'll continue to give, even though he's now not our head coach. I think the legacy will live on massively in our, in our city. I'm living here in the UK, but in our sporting city, there'll be an awful lot still coming from him. So thank you to Pete, and loved it. Loved those 14 years.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I think all of us want to say thank you to Pete Carroll for everything he's brought us and this franchise in the city of Seattle. I've been saving this because I knew Robbie was eventually going to get to where we're wrapping up. I've said several times on this podcast and throughout the years that unless Pete Carroll brought another Super Bowl to Seattle, all he would be remembered for is not handing the ball off to Marshawn Lynch on the half-yard line. And I am very happy to say that, at least for me, is not the case. Pete Carroll means way too much to me and way too much to the city and this team for one moment to define his career. And I didn't realize that until I knew he was no longer going to be the head coach. Pete Carroll, I think it can be said of almost every head coach or player that comes through a franchise, but I think especially in Pete's case that there's no one that's going to have a bigger or longer lasting legacy, at least from my view, with the Seattle Seahawks than Coach Pete Carroll. And there's going to be a mourning period, and I don't think I've ever been more grateful and more saddened at a member of this franchise moving on.
I think if you're wrong about that, then we've got a hell of a ride coming. Because if Pete Carroll is not, by the end of the next decade, the shining light in our history with head coaches, then the new guy's going to do a great job. So here's hoping that that's the case.
Yeah, I'll wrap things up just by saying once again, Pete Carroll is one of those individuals who I respect, who I look up to, who I model some of my coaching after. I like the way that he takes the extra effort, goes the extra mile in order to lift others up into being the best that they can be. I think that is his true legacy, is that he should be known as being the type of person who always did the right thing with the right motivations, because he took the job in Seattle saying, and he said this in the press conference, and I'm going to butcher it, but I'll paraphrase, that he came in wanting to see if the experiment would work, where you focus on people and you focus on the players over the bottom line and over the overall NFL shield, so to speak. And he did that, and he was able to reach people. He was able to touch the lives of those involved with the organization, but also those in the community and around the league. So that is the legacy of Pete Carroll. It's a people first mentality, and I think that's what's missing in the NFL as a whole. And so I will say to Pete Carroll, from myself and Let's Talk Seahawks, thank you. Much respect. We love you, and we wish all the best going forward. And as always, go Hawks.
Go Hawks.
Go Hawks.